The conditional statement is one of the most basic primitive control flow statements that's available inside of programming. It's available in just about every programming language you can imagine because it's simply that important, that foundational to making logical functional programs work. At its base level, a conditional is nothing more than an if-then-else statement. I bet you already are a little bit familiar with these. And with an if-then-else statement, you are able to create branching paths of code. In action, it looks something like this, right? You start with typically the word if, and then you have a condition, a logical test to see if something is true or not. In this example, I'm asking if the player health is less than or equal to 0. When that's true, you have some amount of code that runs, and when it's false, you have some amount of code that runs. And so you end up with these two different branches of your code that might execute under different conditions. You've got your if statement, down here you have your then, and over here you have your else. And what's important about these, I spelled else wrong there, is that they are exclusive, right? If your if statement, if your branch goes down one branch, it does not go down the other branch. They are exclusive to one another. So an if statement cuts off portions of your code from other portions of your code. On top of that, your branches can spawn additional branches. You can have nesting of your if statements. So even after you've had an if statement, inside of the then clause, for instance, you can have another if statement. And inside of that, you could have another if statement and another one, so on and so on. These can branch as much as needed in order to support the logic of your program. And this is so important because programs are meant to be, well, the phrase I like to use is logically malleable. Software can do different things based not on what you know ahead of time, but rather what's happening at runtime, what's happening when the program is executing. So if statements can change how your program works depending on any number of different factors. User input maybe is the most common, but they can change how they work based on the time of day it is, how much data volume they have to process, what they see inside of the data that they're processing. Anything that the computer, your software can look at, it can make decisions about it. It can include in an if statement, and it can branch its code and create a conditional execution of code based on that information. Now, one thing that you do have to be aware of, and I just described how you could create a number of nesting, branching if statements if you wanted, is that the overuse of conditionals can really get into poor code. Now, I tried to look up some examples of this online, and most of the examples I found were from Microsoft Excel, where it is absolutely an issue. It's exacerbated by the fact that Excel formulas are very poorly formatted. I mean, even under the best circumstances, this single line, open, close, paren thing is difficult to read. Once you nest a few if statements inside of each other, I don't know, that's nigh near unreadable to me. I mean, I don't know how you would work on that, how you would maintain it, if there was a bug in it, how you would identify that bug. It's not great, though, even when you get down into something like Python. Here's a similar example in Python code where I've nested a bunch of if statements. And this is a pretty basic example, but you can see here once you've got a bunch of these if statements clogged up inside of each other, it can be difficult to determine what is happening when and which branches of code are actually going to execute. So if this one executes here, then okay, then this still has a possibility of executing. You can see how maintaining this code or working through it could get difficult. And that is, well, that's one of your number one signs of poor code. If it's hard to read, it's hard to maintain. If it's hard to maintain, it's hard to squash bugs. It's hard to identify bugs in the first place, and they end up in your final code. The solutions here are, well, they are many, and they're going to depend on your situation, but switch statements are a common solution. Switch statements are like sort of big, long, well-formatted if-then-else statements. Also, grouping your code into functions can make a lot of sense and can help you reduce nesting of if statements. And the architecture object-oriented programming, which we're going to talk a lot about, is going to allow you to get rid of a lot of these nested if statements and organize your code more around objects as opposed to around logical flow. The end result is conditionals are important. You're going to see them in just about every code, every program that you write. You're going to know how to use them. You probably already understand how to use them at a pretty intrinsic level, but I think it's important to identify that these are really a basic and important part of controlling which code is executing inside of your program at which times. So that is the basic fundamentals of your conditional statement. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.